Princess Silara stood on the grand balcony of the imperial palace, gazing at the twin moons of Zorvenis. Their silver light bathed the city in an ethereal glow, reflecting off the towering crystal spires that stretched toward the heavens. This was her home, her empire, and one day it was supposed to be hers to rule. But tonight, everything would change. The grand hall behind her was filled with nobles, warriors, and scholars, all gathered to celebrate her ascension as the next ruler of the Zorveni Empire. She had trained for this day her entire life. As the daughter of Emperor Velix, she had mastered diplomacy, war, and, most importantly, the unique bioenergy that only her species possessed. It was a sacred power, a force that flowed through the Zorvani, allowing them to enhance their speed, strength, and even heal their wounds. Silara had once been the strongest of them all, but fate was cruel. As she turned to step back inside, a sharp whistle sliced through the air. A moment later, pain exploded in her back. She gasped, stumbling forward as a searing energy pulse burned through her spine. The world tilted, her vision blurred, and before she could react, she crashed onto the marble floor. Screams filled the hall. Guards rushed forward, weapons drawn. She heard her father's voice, shouting commands, but her body refused to move. The pain was unbearable, spreading like wildfire through her limbs. She tried to summon her bioenergy, to heal herself, but nothing happened. Her power, gone. Darkness swallowed her. Silara awoke in the Imperial Medical Chamber, surrounded by sterile white walls and the hum of advanced healing machines. Her body felt heavy, lifeless. She tried to sit up but couldn't. Panic surged through her as she realized she could not feel her legs. "No, no, this cannot be," she whispered, her voice hoarse. A figure stepped forward. It was her father, Emperor Velix, his golden robes flowing as he gazed down at her, but there was no warmth in his eyes, only disappointment. "You have been gravely injured," he said, his voice heavy. "The energy blast severed your spinal connection. The healers have done all they can." Silara's breath quickened. "Then, I will recover, won't I?" The Emperor's expression remained cold. "No." The word hit her harder than the blast itself. She reached for her bioenergy, desperate to feel the familiar pulse within her veins. Nothing. It was as if a part of her soul had been ripped away. "Your connection to the energy is lost," her father continued. "Without it, you can no longer fight, no longer heal, no longer rule." Tears burned in her eyes. "But I am still your daughter. I can still serve the Empire in other ways." The Emperor turned away. A ruler must be strong. A ruler must be whole. She could not believe what she was hearing. You would cast me aside." His silence was her answer. Days turned into weeks. The news of Silara's fall spread across the empire. Where once she had been celebrated, now she was ignored. Servants who once bowed to her now averted their gaze. The nobles whispered in the halls, speaking of a new heir, one who was worthy. Her siblings, once her closest allies, visited her only to offer empty words of sympathy. They were not mourning her, only waiting for their chance to claim the throne. She was no longer a princess. She was a burden. One night, 2 royal guards entered her chamber. She looked up, confused. "You are to leave the palace," one of them said. She stared at them in disbelief. "What?" "The council has declared you unfit to rule," the second guard stated. "You will be transported to an outpost world where you will live in exile." Exile. Silara wanted to scream, to fight, to prove them wrong. But how could she? She was powerless. The guards lifted her onto a hover chair and carried her through the halls she once ruled. The nobles watched in silence. Some pitied her, others smirked. She was taken to a ship, a cold metal prison that would take her far away from everything she had ever known. As the engines roared and the ship launched into the void, Silara clenched her fists. Her people had abandoned her. Her family had betrayed her. She was nothing to them now, but she would not break. No matter where the stars took her, she would survive. She would rise again, even if she had to do it without them. The sky above was a dull shade of gray, thick clouds covering the twin suns. The air smelled of damp earth and metal, the scent of a world abandoned by time. Princess Silara sat on the cold stone floor of a ruined shelter, staring at the barren wasteland before her. She had been exiled to Voron 4, a desolate mining planet long forgotten by the Zorveni Empire. Once, it had been rich in resources, but after the mines ran dry, it was abandoned, leaving behind only rusted structures and empty buildings. Now, it was a graveyard of metal and stone, a fitting place for someone discarded by her own people. Her legs, useless, lifeless, remained still. She had spent hours trying to move them, willing her body to heal, but her bioenergy was truly gone. She had nothing left. A cold wind blew through the ruins, sending dust swirling in the air. Silara pulled her thin cloak tighter around herself. The palace had been warm, filled with silk and luxury. Here, the nights were freezing, the days scorching. There was barely enough food, and the supplies the Empire had left her wouldn't last long. Was this how she was meant to die? Forgotten. Alone. She clenched her fists. No. If she was to die, she would not fade away quietly. But how could she survive in a world that had nothing left? A visitor in the wasteland. Days passed. Silara rationed what little food she had, scavenging through abandoned storage units for anything useful. Most were empty, long picked clean by time or scavengers. The loneliness pressed against her, heavier than the weight of her broken body. And then she saw him, a figure in a worn-out jacket, standing near an old mining facility. He was taller than a Zorvani, broad-shouldered, moving with a confident ease. But what caught Silara's attention most was his face. His features were unlike any she had ever seen. His skin was rough, his jaw square, his eyes sharp with intelligence. A human. She had heard of them before. The Zorvani saw them as a primitive race, clever but weak, lacking bioenergy, relying only on their machines. And yet this one stood in the wasteland as if he'd longed there. He hadn't seen her yet. She had a choice, stay hidden or reveal herself. Silara straightened. She was no beggar. If she was to meet this human, she would do so with dignity. With effort, she pulled herself forward, dragging her lifeless legs. It was slow, painful, humiliating, but she did not stop. She reached the edge of the ruined shelter and spoke. "You, human." The man turned, startled. His eyes landed on her, widening slightly in surprise. Then, to her irritation, his expression softened. "Damn," he muttered. "You look like you've been through hell." She lifted her chin. "I do not need your pity." He raised an eyebrow. "Good. I wasn't offering any." Silara blinked. That was unexpected. Most who saw her now either looked at her with pity or disgust. But this human spoke to her as if she were still whole. He took a step closer, studying her. "You're Zorvani, aren't you? Didn't think I'd find one out here." She hesitated. Revealing her identity could be dangerous. But what did it matter? She had nothing left to lose. "I am Princess Silara of the Zorveni Empire." The human let out a low whistle. "A princess. Guess I should be bowing or something." He smirked, then crossed his arms. "Except you're out here alone, in the middle of nowhere. So either you ran away, or someone didn't want you around anymore." Silara's hands curled into fists. "I was betrayed." The human's smirk faded. He studied her again, this time with something different in his eyes. Not pity. Understanding. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know how that feels." A hand extended. The human introduced himself as Daniel Carter, a trader, explorer, and former soldier. He had been passing through Voron 4 when his ship malfunctioned, forcing him to land for repairs. "You won't last long out here," he said as he crouched beside her. "Food's scarce, And this place isn't exactly friendly. Silara scowled. I do not need your help. Daniel snorted. Sure you don't. That's why you're sitting here in the dirt, starving. Anger flared in her chest, but before she could respond, he continued. Look, I don't know what your empire did to you, but I do know this. If they sent you here, they expected you to die. He extended a hand. You want to prove them wrong. Silara stared at his hand. No Zorvani would have offered it. To them, she was broken, worthless. But this human, this stranger, was offering her something different. A chance. A choice. Her pride screamed at her to reject it, but pride would not keep her alive. Slowly, she reached forward, placing her hand in his. Daniel gripped it firmly and pulled her up. Come on, princess. Let's get you out of here. For the first time since her exile, Silara felt something stir inside her. Hope. The ship, the Odyssey, was nothing like the grand vessels of the Zorvani Empire. It was smaller, built for function rather than beauty, with metal corridors that hummed softly as the engines powered through the stars. It smelled of oil, metal, and something faintly burnt, far from the perfumed halls of the palace Silara once called home. But to her, it was freedom. Daniel Carter had taken her aboard without hesitation, despite knowing nothing about her except that she had been cast aside. Now she sat in the dimly lit cargo bay, her useless legs stretched out before her, watching him as he rummaged through a supply crate. You're gonna need these, Daniel said, tossing something toward her. She caught it, barely. A set of metal braces, heavy, unpolished. Her fingers traced the surface, confused. What are these? Leg supports. If you're gonna move again, you'll need to start with the basics. He knelt beside her, adjusting the straps. I had a buddy in the war who lost his legs. Didn't stop him. He learned to walk again using something like these. Silara stiffened. I told you before. I am Zorvani. Without my bioenergy, I can never walk again. Daniel snorted. That's what they told you. Doesn't mean it's true. She glared at him. You do not understand. My people. I understand plenty, he interrupted. You Zorvani think strength comes from power. That without your fancy energy, you're nothing. Well, guess what? He tapped his chest. Humans don't have bioenergy. Never did. And yet, we've survived, fought wars, built empires, conquered stars. Silara frowned. Through machines. Daniel shrugged. Yeah. And through willpower. You think you're weak. Fine. Stay weak. But if you want to prove your people wrong, if you want to stand again, then stop whining and put on the damn braces. His words stung. No one had ever spoken to her this way. In the palace, everyone had treated her with either respect or pity. No one had dared to challenge her. She looked down at the braces, something boiling inside her. Prove them wrong. Silara gritted her teeth and reached for the straps. The first step, the first attempt was humiliating. Silara had always been strong, graceful. She had once moved through the halls of the palace like a warrior, every step controlled, every motion effortless. Now she was nothing more than a struggling fool. She gripped the parallel bars Daniel had set up in the cargo bay, her arms trembling as she tried to lift herself. The metal braces locked around her legs felt stiff and unnatural, heavy like chains dragging her down. Her muscles screamed. Her body shook. She fell. Daniel, standing nearby, didn't move to catch her. She glared up at him. You let me fall. You needed to, he said simply. Silara clenched her jaw. Her people would have never let her fall. They would have rushed to pick her up, whispering about how tragic it was, about how she had once been great. But Daniel, he just stood there, watching, waiting, as if he expected her to get up. She growled under her breath and forced herself up again. Pain and progress. Days passed. The training continued. Silara fell, again and again. Each time, Daniel just stood nearby, arms crossed, watching with sharp, observant eyes. He never helped, never pitied her. He only gave her one order: get up. She cursed him. She hated him. And yet, she got up. Slowly, painfully, she learned. Her arms grew stronger, supporting her weight as her legs adjusted to the braces. Every movement was a battle, but she refused to surrender. One day, as she gripped the bars, panting from exhaustion, Daniel stepped forward. "Good," he said. "You're ready for the next step." Silara wiped sweat from her brow. "Next step." Daniel grinned and tossed something toward her. "A wooden staff. Time to teach you how to fight. Strength without power." At first, Silara thought it was a joke. She was a trained warrior, or at least she had been. She had wielded energy blades, fought in duels, commanded troops. But now she could barely stand. "How am I supposed to fight like this?" she snapped. Daniel spun his own staff in one hand, raising an eyebrow. "Ever heard of Earth's greatest warriors? Samurai, knights, martial artists. None of them had bioenergy. And yet, they were deadly." Silara hesitated. She had studied history. She had heard whispers of human wars, of how they fought with strategy, not just power. Daniel stepped forward, swinging the staff toward her, not too hard, but enough to test her reflexes. She barely blocked in time, her arms shaking from the force. "Too slow," he said. Again. They trained for hours. Strike, block, dodge. She learned to use her upper body, to shift her balance, to fight in ways she had never considered before. It was different. It was frustrating. But for the first time since her exile, she felt alive. The warrior awakens. One night, as she sat in the cockpit, staring at the stars, Daniel walked up beside her. "You're getting stronger," he said. She flexed her fingers. "I still cannot fight like before." "Maybe not," Daniel admitted, "but you're learning to fight in a new way." He looked at her. "That's what humans do. We adapt. We survive." Silara considered his words. Her people had called her weak because she had lost her power. But humans? They had never needed power. They had conquered galaxies through sheer will. Perhaps she had been looking at strength the wrong way. As she stared out into the vastness of space, she made a silent promise. She would not remain a broken princess. She would become something new, something stronger. And when the time came, she would show the Zorveni Empire exactly what they had thrown away. The hum of the Odyssey's engines echoed through the metal corridors as the ship drifted through deep space. Silara sat in the training room, gripping the wooden staff in her hands. The cold metal braces on her legs felt lighter now. Weeks of training had turned pain into endurance, frustration into determination. Across from her, Daniel stood with his own staff, spinning it lazily in one hand. His stance was relaxed, but Silara had learned that was just an illusion. The human fought with a strange, unpredictable rhythm. One moment calculated, the next reckless. It frustrated her. It fascinated her. "All right, princess," Daniel said with a grin. "Let's see if you're ready for the real thing." Silara tightened her grip. She had trained for this. No more stumbling. No more hesitation. This time, she would win. Daniel struck first, fast as always. She blocked, her arms steady. He swung again, lower, toward her legs. Instead of trying to dodge, she planted herself, using the braces for balance. She caught his staff with her own and twisted, forcing him back. Daniel whistled. Not bad. Silara didn't give him time to recover. She lunged forward, using the momentum to drive her staff toward his side. He barely dodged in time. For the first time, he looked surprised. Good. She pressed the attack, striking again and again. He blocked, countered, but she kept up. Her movements were different now. Sharper, stronger. She was no longer trying to fight like a Zorveni warrior. She was fighting like a human. Finally, she saw an opening. Daniel lifted his staff for a strike, and in that instant, Silara swept her own weapon low. It struck his ankle. Daniel lost balance. He stumbled backward, barely catching himself before he hit the ground. Silence. Then he chuckled. "Well, Dan." Silara breathed heavily, gripping her staff. She had won. She had defeated a human warrior. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "All right. I admit it. You're getting dangerous." A small smile tugged at her lips. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful without her bioenergy. A message from the past. Later that night, Silara sat in the cockpit, gazing at the endless stars. She should have felt victorious, but something else tugged at her mind. Her past. Her people. She had trained. She had adapted. But the question remained, what now? The Zorvani Empire had cast her out, declared her useless. Would she simply wander the stars forever, living as an outcast? Or was there still a path forward? She clenched her fists. No, she would not run forever. She would find her own place in this galaxy. A soft beep interrupted her thoughts. She turned toward the control panel. One of the ship's communication devices was blinking. An incoming message. She frowned. Who would be contacting the Odyssey? She pressed a button. A small hologram flickered to life. Her breath caught. The image was of Kethar, a former Zorvani general. He had once been one of her father's most trusted warriors, but now his face was worn, his eyes shadowed with concern. "Princess Silara," his voice was grave. "If you are hearing this, then I fear for the Empire." Silara straightened. "The High Council has declared a new heir," Kethar continued. "Your brother, Prince Phalar, now sits on the throne." Her brother. Silara's chest tightened. Phalar had always been ambitious, but she never thought he would betray her like this. "But something is wrong," Kethar went on. "Phalar is not acting alone. There are whispers of an outside force, an unknown power manipulating the Empire from the shadows." Silara's hands trembled. "An outside force. I do not know who they are, but they grow stronger. And soon, the Empire will no longer belong to the Zorvani." Kethar's expression darkened. "If you still live, Princess, the Empire may need you more than ever." The message ended. Silence filled the cockpit. Silara stared at the empty space where the hologram had been. Her brother, the Empire, an outside force. She had believed her people had abandoned her, that they wanted nothing to do with her. But now, they were in danger. She exhaled slowly. She had a choice. She could ignore the message, continue her life as an outcast. The Empire had thrown her away. Why should she fight for them? But she had spent weeks training, adapting, surviving. Not just to prove them wrong, to prove herself right. Silara closed her eyes. She was no longer the princess they had abandoned. She was something stronger. She opened her eyes and reached for the controls. It was time to return, to face her brother, to take back what was once hers. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. The decision. Daniel entered the cockpit just as she finished setting the ship's course. He raised an eyebrow. "Going somewhere, Princess?" Silara turned to him, her voice steady. "I'm going home." Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And I'm guessing you're not going back just to say hello." "No," she said. "The Empire is in danger. Something is coming." Daniel studied her for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. "Well," he said, "I was getting bored anyway." She frowned. "You would come with me?" "Of course," he said. "You think I trained you just to let you run off and get yourself killed." Silara blinked. A strange warmth filled her chest. Daniel wasn't Zorvani. He wasn't family. But he had stood by her, pushed her, believed in her when no one else had. Maybe that was what made humans so different. Their strength wasn't just in their bodies. It was in their hearts. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of strength she needed now. With one final breath, Hilara turned to the stars. "Let's go." The Odyssey surged forward, cutting through the darkness. She was no longer just a fallen princess. She was a warrior, and she was coming home. The stars blurred as the Odyssey traveled at light speed, cutting through the cold void of space. Hilara sat in the cockpit, her eyes fixed on the glowing coordinates of Zorvan Prime, her homeworld. The place that had abandoned her, the place she would now return to. Her fingers tightened around the armrests. It had been months since she had last seen her people. Would they even recognize her? Thinking about backing out, Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, that ever-present smirk on his face. She scoffed. "No, I am simply preparing myself." "Right." He stepped forward, placing a hand on the control panel. "So what's the plan?" "We land, walk up to your brother, and say, 'Hey, Valor, long time no see. Mind explaining why you're working with some mysterious enemy?'" Hilara sighed. "It will not be that simple. If what General Kethar said is true, then my brother has already seized full control of the Empire. He will not welcome me back." Daniel shrugged. "Guess we'll have to change his mind." Hilara hesitated. "And you? You are human. The Zorvani do not trust your kind." Daniel grinned. "They don't have to. They just need to know what happens when they mess with someone I care about." Her chest tightened at his words, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. There was no time for distractions. She looked back at the screen. Zorvan Prime was only minutes away. It was time. Landing on Zorvan Prime. The ship broke through the planet's atmosphere, shaking slightly as Daniel guided it toward a small hidden canyon outside the capital city. From the window, Hilara saw the towering crystal spires of Zorvan Prime's capital, Solvaris, gleaming under the twin suns. It was still beautiful, majestic, but something felt different, cold. Even from here, she could sense it. Daniel landed the ship smoothly, shutting off the engines. "All right, princess, time for a homecoming." Hilara exhaled and stood. The metal braces on her legs hummed softly as she adjusted to the movement. She had trained for this. She had fought for this. Now, she would face it. The city of silence. The streets of Solvaris were not how she remembered them. Before, the city had been alive, filled with Zorvani of all ranks and status moving about, speaking, trading, training. Now, there was an eerie silence. The markets were half empty. The usual glowing banners of the Empire had been replaced with dark insignias. Valor's personal crest. He had not just taken the throne. He had changed the Empire. Hilara walked cautiously through the streets, her hood pulled low. Daniel walked beside her, keeping a hand near his weapon. He might have been an outsider, but even he could sense the tension in the air. A group of Zorvani guards marched past them, their armor sleek and polished. But Hilara noticed something strange. They were moving in formation, patrolling aggressively, watching the citizens with suspicion. "This isn't normal, is it?" Daniel whispered. "No," she murmured. "Valor has turned Solvaris into a military stronghold. Something was very wrong." An old ally. Hilara led Daniel through the winding back streets until they reached a small, hidden doorway. She knocked twice, then 3 times in quick succession. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the door slid open just enough for a pair of golden Zorvani eyes to peek out. The figure gasped. "Hilara." She nodded. "It is me, Chiron." The door opened wider, and Hilara quickly stepped inside, pulling Daniel in behind her. Inside, she saw Chiron, a former palace scholar and one of her childhood friends. He looked thinner than before, his usually bright blue robes now dull and tattered. His expression was filled with shock and disbelief. "You're alive," he whispered. "I am," she said. "And I need answers." Chiron gestured for them to sit. "I do not know everything, but what I do know is this. Valar's rise to power was not natural. At first he ruled as expected, claiming the throne after your exile. But then, something changed. Selara listened carefully as Chiron continued. He began to purge those who questioned him. Many of the noble houses have disappeared. The military has grown stronger. And the strangest part, Chiron hesitated. I have heard rumors that Valar does not act alone. Silara's heart pounded. An outside force. Chiron nodded. I do not know who they are, but Valar receives visitors, figures cloaked in darkness, ones who never show their faces. And ever since they arrived, the Empire has not been the same. Daniel frowned. Sounds like your brother made a deal with the devil. Silara's hands clenched into fists. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it worse. Her people were not just under new leadership. They were under control. And she needed to stop it. The next move. What do we do now? Daniel asked. Silara looked at Chiron. Do you still have allies? Chiron hesitated, then nodded. There are a few. Rebels who do not agree with Valar's rule. But we are scattered, leaderless. Silara stood. Not anymore. Both Daniel and Chiron looked at her in surprise. You mean to fight? Chiron asked. Silara met his gaze, fire burning in her eyes. I mean to take back my people. Chiron exhaled. Then you will need more than just a few rebels. You will need an army. Silara turned to Daniel. Humans have fought against impossible odds before. If you were in my place, what would you do? Daniel smirked. I'd start by gathering every outcast, every forgotten warrior, every person Valar has cast aside. They might not have power, but they have something stronger. Silara raised an eyebrow. And what is that? Daniel's smirk widened. The will to fight. Silara took a deep breath. She had spent months learning what it meant to be strong without her power. Now she would teach her people the same lesson. Valar thought he had broken her, but she had returned. And soon, the Empire would remember the name Princess Silara. The underground chamber was dimly lit, the air thick with quiet whispers and tension. Silara stood at the center, her sharp eyes scanning the small crowd of rebels gathered before her. These were Zorvani outcasts, warriors stripped of their honor, merchants whose businesses had been crushed under Valar's rule, scholars who had been silenced for questioning the new empire. She could see it in their faces, fear, anger, uncertainty. They had lost their homes, their families, their freedom. But beneath the fear, Silara also saw something else. Hope. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. You all know who I am, she said, her voice steady. You know what the High Council declared about me, that I was weak, that I was useless, that I was unworthy to stand among you. Murmurs spread through the crowd. They had all heard the lies. Silara raised her chin. And yet, I stand before you now. Silence fell. I have trained. I have fought. I have learned the ways of humans, who do not rely on energy, yet still stand undefeated among the stars. Her gaze hardened. Valar thought he could take the throne and bend the empire to his will. But he has sold our people to an unknown enemy. He is no longer our leader. He is a puppet. A low growl rippled through the gathered Zorvani. Silara took a step closer. I will not stand by and watch our empire fall into the hands of shadows. I have returned, not as a fallen princess, but as a warrior. Her voice rose with conviction. Who will stand with me? For a moment, no one spoke. The rebels exchanged uneasy glances. Then, an old Zorvani soldier stepped forward. His horns were cracked, his armor dented, but his eyes burned with determination. I fought for the Empire once, he said gruffly. I lost my rank when I refused to follow Valar's orders. He clenched his fists. I will fight for it again. I will fight for you, Princess Silara. Another voice joined in. Then another. And another. Within moments, the underground chamber erupted in a chorus of voices, swearing loyalty to Xylara. She felt something deep inside her shift. This was no longer about reclaiming her place. This was about saving her people. The human strategy. As the rebels gathered around, discussing their next steps, Daniel leaned casually against the wall, watching with a smirk. "Well, that was a nice speech," he said as Xylara approached. "But words don't win wars. We need a plan." Xylara nodded. "Valor controls the capital. His forces are stronger, and we do not know who his allies are." Daniel crossed his arms. "Then we don't fight him where he's strongest. We make him fight our war." Chiron, the scholar, frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel gestured to the gathered rebels. "You all keep thinking like Zorveni warriors. Big battles, overwhelming power. But humans, we don't always fight fair." He grinned. "We hit where it hurts." Xylara narrowed her eyes. "Go on." "We sabotage his supply routes," Daniel explained. "We disrupt his patrols, spread rumors, create fear among his forces. We make his rule unstable, make his people doubt him." Chiron's eyes widened. "Turn his own empire against him." "Exactly." Daniel grinned. "We don't need to take Solvaris by force. We need to make Valor bleed from within." Xylara considered his words. It was not the Zorveni way. They valued honor in battle, fighting face to face. But she was no longer bound by the old ways. She had learned from humans, and humans survived. She turned to the rebels. "Prepare yourselves. We strike at dawn." The first strike. The Zorveni military outpost stood at the edge of the city, guarding key supply lines. That night, shadows moved in the darkness. Xylara crouched behind a stack of crates, her breath steady. Daniel was beside her, scanning the guards patrolling the area. "3 at the front gate," he whispered. "2 on the tower." Xylara gave a small nod. "I will take the tower." Daniel grinned. "Then I'll handle the gate." They moved swiftly. Xylara climbed the side of the outpost, her body lighter and stronger than before. The guards never saw her coming. She knocked them out silently, disabling the alarms. Below, Daniel took down the front guards with precision, moving faster than any Zorveni had ever seen. Within minutes, the outpost was theirs. The rebels flooded in, seizing weapons, destroying supply caches. By dawn, the first blow against Valor had been struck. And it was only the beginning. Valor's wrath. In the grand halls of the Imperial Palace, Valor stood before a massive holographic screen, his golden armor gleaming under the cold artificial light. A trembling officer knelt before him. "My lord, we lost the outpost. The attackers were rebels." Valor's sharp features darkened. "Who led them?" The officer swallowed hard. "Reports say it was Princess Xylara." Silence. Then, hierarchy. Valor's fist shattered the armrest of his throne. His golden eyes burned with fury. "She is supposed to be dead." His voice was low, dangerous. "My lord," the officer hesitated. "Should we send a full battalion?" "No," Valor said coldly. "She is no longer a simple exile." His fingers tightened. "She is a threat." He turned toward the shadows at the edge of the room. From the darkness, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked in flowing black robes, their face hidden beneath a hood. Valor's voice was calm, but his eyes were filled with hatred. "Find her." His lips curled into a cruel smile. "And bring me her head. A war begins." As the sun rose over Zorvan Prime, Xylara stood on a hill, watching as smoke rose from the fallen outpost. She had struck the first blow, but she knew Valor would strike back. The battle for the Empire had begun, and this time she was ready. The sky above Solvaris burned with the glow of battle. Smoke curled from the ruins of Valor's military outposts, and the streets of the capital echoed with the sounds of rebellion. The once silent city was now alive with resistance. Princess Silara stood at the edge of a rooftop, looking down at the chaos below. The people had risen, and Vaylor's forces struggled to hold control. The plan had worked. Daniel's strategy of striking supply lines and spreading fear had weakened the Empire from within. But now it was time for the final confrontation. Behind her, Daniel adjusted his gear, checking his weapons. "Well, Princess, looks like your people finally believe in you." Silara nodded. "Now, we end this." Her gaze turned toward the Imperial Palace, where her brother waited. She would face him, one last time, breaking through the gates. The Grand Palace gates loomed before them, guarded by elite Zorvani soldiers. They stood firm, energy weapons in hand, ready to protect their emperor. But Silara was no longer the helpless princess they had exiled. She surged forward, her cybernetic leg braces amplifying her speed. The first guard barely had time to react before she disarmed him with a swift strike, sending him crashing to the ground. Daniel fought beside her, moving with human agility that the Zorvani weren't prepared for. With a precise shot, he disabled the palace's energy barrier. The rebels poured in. Silara didn't look back. She sprinted through the halls of the palace, knowing exactly where Vaylor would be. The throne room. Sibling confrontation. The massive doors of the throne room swung open with a deep boom. Silara stepped inside, her breath steady. At the far end, sitting on the golden throne of the Zorvani Empire, was Vaylor. He had been waiting for her. Dressed in black and gold armor, he looked more like a conqueror than a ruler. His golden eyes glowed with power, but also something else. Rage. "I knew you would come," he said, his voice cold. Silara stood tall. "You have betrayed our people." Vaylor scoffed. "I have saved them. The Empire was weak under the old ways, but now we are strong." Silara shook her head. "You are a puppet. You sold our empire to an unknown enemy." Vaylor rose from the throne, his presence commanding. "I did what had to be done. And you are nothing but a broken relic of the past." He raised his hand. A surge of energy crackled around his fingers. Silara tensed. Her brother still wielded the Zorvani power she had lost. But she had something else. She had trained, fought, survived. She would not lose. The battle for the throne. Vaylor struck first. A wave of golden energy blasted toward Silara. She dodged, rolling to the side as the throne room walls shattered from the impact. She charged forward, her movements precise. She didn't need powers. She had skill, she had speed, and she had human tactics. Vaylor swung again, but Silara used his own strength against him, sidestepping and landing a powerful strike to his ribs. He stumbled, shocked by her speed. Daniel's voice echoed in her mind. "Use what they don't expect." She kept moving, striking at weak points, never staying still. Vaylor roared in frustration. He unleashed a final desperate blast of energy, one that could have destroyed her. But she was ready. At the last moment, she redirected his own power, using the techniques she had learned on Earth. The blast rebounded, striking Vaylor square in the chest. He collapsed to his knees, his energy flickering. Silara stood over him, breathing heavily. "It's over, Vaylor," she said. For the first time, she saw something in her brother's eyes that she had never seen before. Fear. The end of Vaylor's rule. The doors burst open as rebels stormed in, their weapons raised. Chiron stepped forward. "The city has fallen. The people have chosen." Vaylor looked around, realization sinking in. His empire, his rule, it was gone. Daniel walked up beside Silara. "What do we do with him?" Silara hesitated. Vaylor was her brother, but he had brought pain and suffering to their people. She turned to the rebels. "The Zorvani will decide his fate," she declared. "Not me. Not him." Chiron nodded. "We will hold a trial. A true trial. For the first time in years, justice would decide, not power." Vaylor was led away, his head hanging low. And with that, his rule ended. A new dawn. As the twin suns of Zorvan Prime rose over the city, Celara stood atop the palace balcony, looking over her people. She was no longer a fallen princess. She was a leader. The Zorvani had seen her weakness, her exile, but they had also seen her rise. Daniel stood beside her, a smirk on his face. "So what now, Your Highness?" Celara took a deep breath. "Now, we rebuild. Together." She turned to him. "Will you stay?" Daniel chuckled. "You think I'd leave after all this? Someone's got to make sure you don't go soft." She smiled. He had fought for her when no one else did. He had shown her that strength wasn't just about power. It was about resilience, courage, and heart. And for the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to be strong. The Empire would never be the same again. And neither would she.